History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 7 The End of the Europeans' World. Chapter 6 The Shaping of a New World. The regime was repressive and stifled criticism. It alienated the intellectuals. Its soldiers, sometimes badly officered and undisciplined, terrorized the peasant as much as did the Japanese. Communist China was different. In large areas controlled by the communists behind the Japanese lines, a deliberate attempt was being made to ensure the support of as wide a spectrum of interests as possible by moderate but unambiguous reform and disciplined behavior. Outright attacks on landlords were usually avoided, but peasant goodwill was cultivated by enforcing lower rents and abolishing usury. Meanwhile, Mao published a series of theoretical writings designed to prepare the new communist cadres for the task that lay ahead. There was a need for political education as the party and the army grew steadily in numbers. When the Japanese collapsed in 1945, there were about 1 million Chinese communist soldiers. The suddenness of victory was the second factor that shaped the last stage of the Chinese Revolution. Huge areas of China had suddenly to be reoccupied and reincorporated in the Chinese state. But many of them were already under communist control before 1945, and others could not possibly be reached by nationalist forces before the communists dug themselves in there. The Americans did what they could by sending soldiers to hold some of the ports until the nationalists could take them over. In some places, the Japanese were told to hold on until the Chinese government could re-establish its authority. But when the final and military phase of the revolution opened, the communists held more territory than they had ever done before and held it in the main with the support of a population who had found that communist rule was by no means as bad as they had heard. Albeit unwittingly, the Japanese, by launching their attack on the KMT regime, had in the end brought about the very triumph of the Chinese Revolution they had long striven to avoid. It is at least possible that if the nationalists had been undistracted by foreign invasion and had not suffered the crippling damage it inflicted, they might have been able to master Chinese communism in the short run. In 1937, the KMT could still draw heavily on patriotic goodwill. Many Chinese believed that it was the authentic carrier of the revolution. The war destroyed the chance of exploiting this, if it were true, but also enabled Chinese to resume at last her long march towards world power from which she had been deflected first by the Europeans and then by the fellow Asians. The long frustration of Chinese nationalism was about to end, and the beneficiaries would be the communists. The defeat of the KMT in the Civil War took 3 years. Although the Japanese usually sought to surrender to the KMT or Americans, the communists had acquired authority in new areas and with it large stocks of arms from them. The Russians, who had invaded Manchuria in the last days of before the Japanese surrender, helped them by giving them access to the Japanese arms there. Mao made deliberately moderate policy pronouncements and continued to push forward with the land reform. This conferred a further great advantage on the communists in the Civil War, which continued until 1949. Victory in that war was essentially a victory of countryside over city-based regime. American policy was increasingly disillusioned by the revealed inadequacy and corruption of the Chiang Kai shek government. In 1947, American forces were withdrawn from China and the United States abandoned the efforts it had hitherto made to mediate between the two Chinas. In the following year, With most of the North in the communist hands, the Americans began to cut down the amount of financial and military aid given to the KMT. From this time on, the nationalist government ran militarily and politically downhill. As this became obvious, more and more employees of the government and local authorities sought to make terms with the communists, while they might still do so. The conviction spread that a new era was dawning. By the beginning of December, no important nationalist military force remained intact on the mainland, and Chiang withdrew to Formosa, Taiwan. The Americans cut off their aid while this withdrawal was underway and publicly blamed the inadequacies of the nationalist regime for the debacle. Meanwhile, on 1st October 1949, the People's Republic of China was officially inaugurated at Peking, and the most populous communist state in the world had come into existence. Once again, the mandate of heaven had passed. In Southeast Asia and Indonesia, the Second World War was as decisive as elsewhere in ending colonial rule, although the pace was bloodier and faster in Dutch and French colonies than British. The grant of representative institutions by the Dutch in Indonesia before 1939 had not checked the growth of a nationalist party, and a flourishing communist movement had appeared by then, too. Some nationalist leaders, among them one Ahmad Sukarno, collaborated with the Japanese when they occupied the islands in 1942. They were in a favorable position to seize power when the Japanese surrendered and proclaimed an independent Indonesian republic before the Dutch could return. Fighting and negotiation followed for nearly 2 years until agreement was reached for an Indonesian republic still under the Dutch crown. This did not work. Fighting went on again, the Dutch pressing forward vainly with their police operations in one of the first campaigns by a former colonial power to attract the full blast of the communist and anti-colonial structure at the United Nations. Both India and Australia, which had concluded that the Dutch would be wise to conciliate the independent Indonesia, which must eventually emerge, took the matter to the Security Council. Finally, the Dutch gave in. The story began by the East India Company of Amsterdam 3.5 centuries before, thus came to an end in 1949 with the creation of the United States of Indonesia, a mixture of more than 100 million people scattered over hundreds of islands of scores of races and religions. A vague union with the Netherlands under the Dutch crown survived, but was dissolved 5 years later. 300,000 Dutch citizens, white and brown, arrived in the Netherlands from Indonesia in early 1950s. For a time, the French in Indochina seemed to be holding better than the Dutch. That area's wartime history had been somewhat different from that of Malaysia or Indonesia, because although the Japanese had exercised complete military control there since 1941, French sovereignty was not formally displaced until March 1945. The Japanese then amalgamated Annam, Ho Chi China, and Tonkin to form a new state of Vietnam under the Emperor of Annam. As soon as the Japanese surrendered, though, the chief of the local Communist Party, the Viet Minh, installed himself in the government palace at Hanoi and proclaimed the Vietnam Republic. This was Ho Chi Minh, a man with long experience in the Communist Party and also in Europe. He had already received American aid and support and believed he had the backing of the Chinese too. The revolutionary movement quickly spread while the Chinese forces entered North Vietnam and British were sent to the south. It was soon evident that if the French wished to re-establish themselves, it would not be easy. The British cooperated with them, but the Chinese did not, and dragged their feet over reimposing French authority. A large expeditionary force was sent to Indochina, and a concession was made in that the French recognized the Republic of Vietnam as an autonomous state within the French Union. But now there arose the question of giving Ho Chi, a major rice producing area, separate status, and on this all attempts to agree broke down. Meanwhile, French soldiers were sniped at and their convoys were attacked. At the end of 1946, there was an attack on residents in Hanoi and many deaths. Hanoi was bombarded, 6,000 were killed and reoccupied by French troops, and Ho Chi Minh fled. Thus began a war which was to last 30 years, in which the communists were to struggle essentially for the nationalist aim of a united country, while the French tried to retain a diminished Vietnam, which, with the other Indo-Chinese states, would remain inside the French Union. By 1949, they had come around to including Cochinchina in Vietnam and recognizing Cambodia and Laos as associate states. But new outsiders were now becoming interested, and the Cold War had come to Indochina. The government of Ho Chi Minh was recognized in Moscow and Peking, that of the enemy's emperor, whom the French had set up by the British and Americans. Thus, in Asia, decolonization quickly burst out of the simplicities Roosevelt had envisaged. As the British began to liquidate their recovered heritage, this further complicated things. Burma and Ceylon became independent in 1947. In the following year, communist-supported guerrilla war began in Malaya, though it was to be unsuccessful and not to impede steady progress towards independence in 1957. It was one of the first of the many post-colonial problems which were to torment American policy. Growing antagonism with the communist world soon cut across visceral anti-colonialism. Only in the Middle East did things go on seemingly clear-cut. In May 1948, a new state, Israel, came into existence in Palestine. This marked the end of 40 years during which only two great powers had needed to agree in order to manage the area. France and Great Britain had not found this too difficult. In 1939, the French still held League of the Nations mandate in Syria and the Lebanon. Their original mandate had been divided into two, and the British retained theirs in Palestine. Elsewhere, in the Arab lands, the British exercised varying degrees of influence or power over the new Arab rulers of individual states. The most important for Iraq, where a small British force, mainly of Air Force units, was maintained, and Egypt, where a substantial garrison still protected the Suez Canal. The latter had become more and more important in the 1930s, as Italy showed increasing hostility to Great Britain. The War of 1939 was to release change in the Middle East, as elsewhere, though this was not at first clear. After Italy's entry into the war, the Canal Zone became one of the most vital areas of British strategy, and Egypt suddenly found herself with a battlefront for a western border. She remained neutral almost to the end, but was in effect a British base and little else. The war also made it essential to assure the supply of oil from the Gulf, and especially from Iraq. This led to the intervention when Iraq threatened to move in a pro-German direction after another nationalist coup in 1941. A British and Free French invasion of Syria to keep it out of German hands led in 1941 to an independent Syria. Soon afterwards, the Lebanon proclaimed its independence. The French tried to re-establish their authority at the end of the war, but unsuccessfully. And during 1946, these two countries saw the last foreign garrisons leave. The French also had difficulties further west, where fighting broke out in Algeria in 1945. Nationalists there were at that moment asking only for autonomy in federation with France, and the French went some way in this direction in 1947. But this was far from the end of the story. Where British influence was paramount, anti British sentiment was still a good rallying cry. In both Egypt and Iraq, there was much hostility to British occupation forces in the post war years. In 1946, the British announced that they were prepared to withdraw from Egypt, but negotiations on the basis of a new treaty broke down so badly that Egypt referred the matter unsuccessfully to the United Nations. By this time, the whole question of the future of the Arab lands had been diverted by the Jewish decision to establish a national state in Palestine by force. The Palestine question has been with us ever since. Its catalyst had been the Nazi Revolution in Germany at the time of the Balfour Declaration. 600,000 Arabs had lived in Palestine besides 80,000 Jews, a number already felt by Arabs to be threateningly large. In some years after this, though Jewish immigration actually exceeded immigration, and there was ground for hope that the problem of reconciling the promise of a national home for Jews with respect for the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, as the Balfour Declaration had put it, might be resolved. Hitler changed this. From the beginning of the Nazi persecution, the numbers of those who wished to come to Palestine rose. As this extermination policies began to unroll in the war years, they made nonsense of British attempts to restrict immigration, which was the side of British policy unacceptable to the Jews. The other side, the partitioning of Palestine, was rejected by the Arabs. The issue was dramatized as soon as the war was over by the World Zionist Congress and their demand that 1 million Jews should be admitted to Palestine at once. Other new factors now began to operate. The British in 1945 had looked benevolently on the formation of an Arab League of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, with Transjordan. There had been in British policy a strand of illusion that pan-Arabism might prove the way in which the Middle East could be persuaded to settle down after post-Ottoman confusion, and that the coordination of the policies of Arab states would be open to the solution of its problems. In fact, the Arab League was soon preoccupied with Palestine to the virtual exclusion of anything else. The other novelty was the Cold War. In the immediate post-war era, Stalin seems to have taken still the old communist view that Great Britain was the main imperialist prop of the international capitalist system. Attacks on its position and influence therefore followed. And in the Middle East, this, of course, coincided with traditional Russian interests, though the Soviet government had shown little interest in the area between 1919 and 1939. Pressure was brought to bear on Turkey at the Straits, and ostentatious Soviet support was given to Zionism, the most disruptive element in the situation. It did not need extraordinary political insight to recognize the implications of a resumption of Russian interest in the area of the Ottoman legacy. Yet, at the same moment, American policy turned anti-British, or rather pro-Zionist. This could hardly have been avoided. In 1946, mid-term congressional elections were held and Jewish votes were important. Since the Roosevelt Revolution in domestic politics, a Democratic president could hardly envisage an anti-Zionist position. Thus beset, The British sought to disentangle themselves from the Holy Land. From 1945, they faced both Jewish and Arab terrorism and guerrilla warfare in Palestine. Unhappy Arab, Jewish, and British policemen struggled to hold the ring, while the British government still strove to find a way acceptable to both sides of bringing the mandate to the end. American help was sought but to no avail. Truman wanted a pro Zionist solution. In the end, the British took the matter to the United Nations. It recommended partition, but this was still a non starter for the Arabs. Fighting between the two communities grew fiercer, and the British decided to withdraw without more ado. On the day that they did so, 14th May 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed. It was immediately recognized by the United States 16 minutes after the Foundation Act and the USSR. They were to agree about little else in the Middle East for the next quarter century. Israel was attacked almost at once by Egypt, whose armies invaded a part of Palestine which the United Nations proposal had awarded to Jews. Jordanian and Iraqi forces supported Palestinian Arabs in the territory proposed for them. But Israel fought off her enemies, and a truce supervised by the United Nations followed, during which a Zionist terrorist murdered the United Nations mediator. In 1949, the Israeli government moved to Jerusalem, a Jewish national capital again for the first time since the days of Imperial Rome. Half of the city was still occupied by Jordanian forces, but this was almost the least of the problems left to the future. With American and Russian diplomatic support and American private money, Jewish Energy and Initiative had successfully established a new national state where no basis for one had existed 25 years before. Yet the cost was long to go on being paid. The disappointment and humiliation of the Arab states assured their continuing hostility to it, and therefore opportunities for great power intervention in the future. Moreover, the action of Zionist extremists and Israeli forces in 1948 to 1949 led to an exodus of Arab refugees. Soon, there were 750,000 of them in camps in Egypt and Jordan, a social and economic problem, a burden on the world's conscience, and a potential military and diplomatic weapon for Arab nationalists. It would hardly be surprising, were it true, as some students believe, that the first president of Israel quickly encouraged his country's scientists to work on a nuclear energy program. Thus, many currents flowed together in a curious and ironical way to swirl in confusion in an area which had always been a focus of world history. Victims for centuries, the Jews were in their turn now seen by the Arabs as persecutors. The problems with which the peoples of the area had to grapple were poisoned by forces flowing from the dissolution of centuries of Ottoman power, from the rivalries of successor imperialisms, and in particular from the rise of two new world powers, which dwarfed these in their turn. From the interplay of 19th century European nationalism and the ancient religion, and from the first effects of a new dependence of developed nations in oil. There were few moments in the 20th century so soaked in history as the establishment of Israel. It is a good point at which to pause before turning to the story of the rest of the 20th century.